There are 10-year-old children in India that hand-stitch soccer balls for a nickel an hour to pay off lifelong debts that they incurred buying medicine. This should never happen. White people's money is the most dangerous pitfall that people of colors could ever fall into. The fear of not having any money, losing money. If Caucasians' economic system fall or crash, don't lose your wits. Your wits can't be taken away from you. Also, maintain good health. Health is true wealth. Whites know this. That is why the land and countries that white people have interest in suddenly become disease-filled. Health is wealth, not white people's money. Don't let the things that they make important don't let the things that they make important to them take precedence in your life. Money is just a piece of paper. It's not land, grass, trees, fertile soil. It's not livestock, mountain springs, lumber, or even bronze. It is unnatural to give control to something that cannot sustain you naturally. Money is not trout, whiting, or salmon. Money and monetary systems are little of pieces of paper, averages, and digital tickers. Money is not real. Grain is, wheat is, apple juice is. Don't let the financial woes make you lose your marbles. The planet Earth will sustain you. Current financial systems and models are established by whites who generally have an adverse history with people of color. It can be increasingly difficult to win at a game created by those who have done you harm. A game that is set up for whites to win and for you to lose. A game that, when you decide to play, you will always be far behind them. Such is the game of economic success or the attainment of their wealth. The faster non-whites run on that carrot wheel, the quicker they will tire themselves out. In the process, losing the interest and energy needed to strengthen their minds. People of color have been born with means to sustain themselves naturally from the land without a bank account or a credit card. This is why the school and office setting systems don't truly resonate with non-whites, because people of color are people of nature, and being cooped up inside a Caucasian building doing something that does not exercise you physically is not natural. Harmony with nature means reaping what you sow and being naturally equipped to provide just enough for yourself and your family, not exploiting the earth's resources as gluttonous whites continue to do on a day-to-day basis. People of color will begin to experience true wealth once they move away from the synthetic customs and systems that harm them and move forward toward their original nature. Lesser evils. A large misconception that non-whites have is that they are obligated to select from the choices that Caucasians set before them. People of color are no longer required to choose from the opinions, the options that whites leave behind. The time is now for non-whites to create their own options. Take a very simple conversation example. A person of color decides to make a stance for his or her own cultural group. Whites will attack them and in conversation ask something unrelated like, "So you want to kill all whites? Or do you hate white people?" But that person of color can reply by saying that they reject both suggestions and go on to clearly communicate their position. Or, a larger instance, choosing between two rich white candidates to govern poor people. This is illogical. Non-white people are beginning to learn the advantages of crafting their own options established by themselves and for their own benefit. Shadowboxing. No matter what, people of color should always acknowledge and say hello to their fellow people of color in passing, always. Over time, whites have encouraged the process of white love and ethnic hate, especially amongst non-whites. Caucasians will incite people of color to fight themselves based on information that whites provide. This is the white way of working through people of color by having them hate what white people hate. People of color should never fall for the trap of going against other cultures because white people told them to. White people will instigate and have poor people fighting one another, thinking their cousins, brothers, and sisters are their enemies. Also, with the full knowledge of history and its effects, while people will accuse other cultures of similar crimes knowing that these non-whites are clashing over white money, jobs, and interests, this deception and feigned ignorance is a crime unto itself. Don't let white people tell you that another person of color is to blame for your poverty, the way that they pit Zimbabweans against South Africans in Africa, or blacks against Mexicans for white people's jobs. The truth of the matter is white people versus the rest of the world. End of story. Check history. They have screwed everyone and everything over equality. If you have whites in your land, chances are times are hard for the people of color, but everything is fine for the whites. The whites are going to the whites are going to deflect attention away from themselves by telling you that another non-white culture is the problem, encouraging dissension and tension among non-whites so that they can never unify. People of color should be careful of fighting themselves. Energy should be focused on fighting against and gang banging on the white systems that can ruin them. The true fight for non-whites is not a physical fight with the people of color, but a mental one with white people's paradigms. Combat this. Focus all of your anger and animosity on that. All unchecked aggression should be rechanneled from physical aggression into mental aggression. Then aim your intelligence at your real enemies, the systems that whites have in place, the media, schooling, financial constructs, etc. Train your anger on these real enemies and figure out a way to combat, attack, and riot against those systems. Chasing white. First law of nature is self-preservation. Not chase white people. It's imperative that people of color stop attempting to find a crack in whites' program to permanently insert themselves in. Non-whites will fare much better to pursue the preservation of their people regardless of cues from whites. Early on, the desire for equality became confused and purposely misinterpreted as a need for acceptance into the white world. Success was associated with being white. Money meant white. People of color set out to fight economic hardship, and in some cases, they found themselves always at the coattails of whites. People of color should realize what true wealth is. It is not being white or having white money. In fact, no action or motives of non-whites should be predicated by a negative or positive stimulus from white people. People of color's actions should be executed with the goal of preserving themselves and a future for their offspring. The old ways were if whites were polite, then you respond nicely. Or if whites call you a slur, then you get angry. This is too much control over the cultures. Following the cues of whites can leave you at a disadvantage because they can and will misdirect you. Break this control and focus on preservation with or without whites, and regardless of what whites do to you, whether they are malicious or polite, whether they hire or fire you. Temporarily working with whites is only a means and not an end. Remember that you do not simply want the company of whites. You want a balanced, healthy means of subsistence. which may not even require their financial ideas, systems, and worthless paper money with their faces on it. Don't just aspire to work in their buildings, lead their buildings and create a new alternative method of commerce. Running the race on a track that whites built surely spells defeat for people of color. When people don't intend to be poor, they should focus on that and what it will require to truly escape poverty, not simply trying to be white or having what whites have. When you follow behind whites, you will always be just that, behind them. Chapter 10. I wish I were white people. Occasionally, encounters will arise with persons of color who seem more intent upon furthering the interests of customs of whites. Everything that has been discussed in this book with reference to whites should be magnified by 4 or 5 when dealing with non-whites who love Caucasians more than themselves. I wish I were white. People need to be dealt with just as cautiously as whites, or even more so at times, because they will try harder. Any injustice or rudeness expected by whites will be intensified at the hands of those who wish they were white, but are not. Their struggle is born out of the unique circumstance which forces them to prove their whiteness to themselves and to whites. That's double convincing, double the effort. Consider that in Asia, as a result of white interest and influence, the Japanese neglect to even illustrate Asians in their animation and video games. They use their talents to draw white people to tell their own stories. Even in the United States, as whites clearly communicate who is considered an American by screwing their laws and policies to favor whites, or prominently displaying whites on the majority of their magazine covers and billboards in every city, non-whites still clamor to be included and referred to as Americans. This tell one thing and show another tactic affects people of color by intensifying Caucasian worship. As a result, some ethnic groups fashion or formulate an unnatural hatred for people of color by adopting a hatred of what whites despise most, non-white people. In some cases, where one person of color intends to fully integrate into the white world, they may go so far as to shed their own ethnicity and hate the current culture that whites are mocking at the time. For example, when Asians hate blacks or when East Indians hate Latinos, they are completely oblivious to the asinine nature of feeding racism against someone with the same complexion as them. Black and Latino cops are notorious for this cowardice. When they join the racist police force, the unspoken rule is that they must choose the color that is neither black nor brown, but blue, consequently turning a blind eye and deaf ear to brutality, abuse, and murder of their own people. Whites create the catalyst that this behavior through their rejection of difference. Even when Caucasians do something minor, like flinching when they hear a voice deeper than their own, this causes some non-whites to make their voices squeaky in order to be accepted as talking white. Practices like these, on a small and large scale, serve to condition some individuals of color, forcing them to assimilate and become something other than what they are naturally, acting white. White people came, saw, and told the people who welcomed them that they were inferior. This was a key component in the erection of the colonies that whites set up in lands that were not theirs. Whites left these colonies after establishing control of the resources. the indigenous people's minds or by force. In some countries like South Africa, whites remain and haven't been forced out yet. Upon the withdrawal of the whites, some people of color began to assume the identities and the customs of their prior colonists. These are the early roots of non-whites mimicking the behavior of Caucasians. Over time, those who elected to follow behind the white colonists had to accept what the whites would hate, even if it meant hating themselves. This allows racism to exist in a place like India, where Caucasian colonization is a thing of the past. But the ideas of the white colonists can cause the lighter persons to mistreat the darker. The world over, Caucasians told the people of color that they were primitive, outdated, and uneducated. Naturally, as non-whites began to don formal Western-style schooling and dress, they were accused of acting white. Acting white is not simply reduced to being Western schooled. It also extends to mannerism that people of color may pick up from white people, such as raising the pitch of their voice unnecessarily, pretending that your body temperature is cold, or like you are afraid of everything and everyone, and the shade of or complete ignorance of your own culture. The irony of people of color doing this, doing their best white people impersonation, is that the entire masquerade is performed to be approved by whites. But whites don't have the final say and authority of cultural approval. No one does. Furthermore, regardless of the impersonation, whites still won't approve of the non-white individual. They will only lose more respect for the non-white as these actions force the person of color into a more subservient position. And whites will always abuse authority. I'll read that again. And whites will always abuse authority. Being educated or knowledgeable never meant being white. In fact, Western, white, formal schooling all alone is not enough to make a person completely educated or knowledgeable. Being well-groomed, spoken, or respectful is not a characteristic of being white. Chances are, if you are a person of color, your people have inhabited the planet Earth long before whites. In each culture, there is ceremonial, proper dress, and there are well-spoken poets and writers. Whites visited every nation inhabited by people of color and gave the people new identities. Caucasian will steal non-whites' culture and identify, then repackage it and claim it for themselves. Civilization is synonymous with people of color. They should not associate polite traits or being educated with white people. Non-white cultures have their own practices, education, and measure of intelligence. It is not mandatory that they be Caucasian-based or Eurocentric. People of color should cease Caucasian schooling, but always blend it with a deep understanding and appreciation of their own culture and history. Otherwise, they will run the risk of leading a life performing their best white people impression, reaping no real benefits. White man's burden. White man's burden. A compelling pressure that forces whites to try to make everyone like them has been carried out against people of color throughout the world. In some non-whites, exposure to this stimulus has caused a poorly mistaken, undying want to acceptance into white society. Others maintain an indifferent position, remarking, "Oh, it's okay. That's just the way things are." The process can be reversed, however. It must be reversed for the survival of non-whites. Consider, for example, the African and Asian leaders in their home countries shed their own cultures, clothing, and styles of dress for European attire. Although minor, this acceptance of whites' values over one's own contributes to a subconscious, dangerous worship of whites. Why not create a modernized kimono? Japan? There is nothing stopping people of color from updating the designs of the clothing from their corresponding cultures. As non-white people open their minds, options will present themselves. Don't let whites set the only standards of fashion, education, etc. Women of color, there is no need for you to continue showering white women with praise like they are the only standard of beauty. They will only tell you thank you. They will never tell you that you are beautiful or encourage you to be yourself. White people do not generally respect people of color's cultures or natural beauty. When non-whites carry on the standards, ideas, and customs that Caucasians introduce them to, they run the risk of not only aspiring to be whatever they think white is, but they also risk becoming a racist in the process. This is what is meant by the racism without whites. But it does not mean that racism is innate to all people. Be mindful that you don't let white people's wants, desires, and opinions become your own over the long term or on a deep mental level. Don't perpetuate the white man's burden for him in his absence. Chapter 11. Pre-response to critics. This book ain't for you. It's for women of color who find themselves harassed by white police. It's for men of color who are sick of being treated or greeted with fearful stares from whites. It's for children of color who hope we were in a post-racial era only to find themselves kicked out of a public pool. It's for little girls of color that have to go through the supermarket checkout aisles and see 20 magazine covers of blonde-haired white women and no women that look like themselves. This is for all the people of color that don't see people that look like themselves on the billboards in their city. There is no silent complacency. If a people see themselves excluded from everything and ridiculed at every juncture, what are they supposed to be? Happy? Thrilled? Overjoyed to see the images of everyone but themselves plastered in every media outlet throughout the world? What do you expect a person of color to think? They travel around the city and see images of whites and none of themselves. Is it supposed to make them pleasant? Or does logic dictate that tension would easily arise? The entire planet has had an unpleasant relationship with white people. This is a problem that must be identified and addressed, or it will never go away. It serves people of color's absolute best interest to start having these dialogues about white people. Then real issues can make their way out into the open. Whites have shown people of color their position. And now people of color are able to tell the world how they really feel. Examine a small expanse of land of Western Europe. Why are the non-white people of the world all following the dress code, customs, and traditions of these lands? The time is now for people of color to start asking these natural, understandable, logical, and rational questions. Are truth, honesty, and exposure of current state affairs for race relations offensive or derogatory? Can you be supported by white folks and really be for the good of people of color? Is there any record of this in history? Time and time again, when someone speaks truth and shines bright light on a racial issue, white people drag that person through the mud or murder them. This sends a strong message to people of color that whites that essentially say, don't speak out against us. Non-whites can't expect Caucasians to support their own exposure. They have never been huge fans of truth. Religious lies equal white people. Political lies equal white people. Educational lies equal white people. Entertainment lies equal white people. The time is now that these concerns be discussed. When people of color have spoken out against racial injustice in the past, white people rush to accuse them of hating whites. This could be further from the truth. In fact, it is irrelevant. It is the non-whites' own concern with their survival that forces them to speak so sincerely. It is not hate. In fact, it's love. Love for their babies. Love for their brothers, sisters, and cousins. The kind of love that forces you to speak straight without sugarcoating. When whites accuse a person of color who has stood up against injustices at the hands of whites as being anti-white, an interesting train of thoughts arises. If that person of color is fighting against lies, exploitation, and injustice, and whites are against that, then it would seem that white people are saying their way of life is one of oppression, dishonesty, and that it should be understood and accepted. More importantly, by accusing someone that fights racial injustice as being anti-white, it mars that person's message, especially when it is a message of unity. Dealing with the white oppressors is but one step, not the focal point. The underlying messages are pro-color, pro-justice, pro-freedom, pro-equality, not anti-white. Some critics remark that racism and race relations need time to heal, or white people need time to learn how to respect others. And people of color are supposed to wait? No. White people don't delay their racial bigotry. If white people want people of color's land, they don't delay. If a white person grows tired of looking at a non-white face around the office, they don't say, I'm sick of you, but in 10 years, we're going to fire you. No, that person is fired immediately. People of color must delay no longer in examining and understanding the nature and motives of white people. This book is to encourage people of color to share their experiences with these issues amongst each other so that they can know that they are not alone. It is so that they can foster communication with one another, realizing that they are all facing the same issues, and together they can change the way they interact with white people. This book is to help people of color share their experiences and inform them that they must be swift to educate themselves and their children. At this stage, there was little need for non-whites to be concerned with hating white people. But if people of color find themselves accused of such, they need only to inform their accusers that they don't hate white people. It's just that they love people of color. Chapter 12, Cool White People. Very rare occasions will arise where people of color will encounter Caucasians with genuinely good and well-meaning intentions. Let me read that again. Very rare occasions will arise where people of color will encounter Caucasians with genuinely good and well-meaning intentions. This is important to consider so that people of color won't let the adverse effects of negative race relations drive them insane. It's more beneficial to be aware and cautious, but not on edge. Bearing that in mind, there have been sprinkles of isolated incidents where some whites have attempted to aid people of color in their plight, although whites may have been the cause of the plight in the first place. Nevertheless, there were a handful of whites who fought apartheid. There are Civil War letters written by white soldiers expressing their grief and dedication to fight against their own blood brothers for the rights of slaves. You even have whites that have been assassinated by other whites when they stood up for racial justice. These anomalies in Caucasians do exist. However, these types of whites are the minority, the exceptions, not the steadfast, safe rule. These types of whites don't represent the whole of white people. Suppose that 3 out of 10 whites are generally humane, fair, and pleasant. That would leave 70% of whites that are malicious, prejudiced, bigots, hardly something to be ignored. Thus, the mass generalizations are justified in order for people of color to protect themselves from harm or injustice at the hands of whites in the future. I have non-white friends. My best friends are Latino. My wife is Asian. Some of my best friends are black. I am your friend. I am your friend. I am not racist. I am not racist. These are common defenses whites will use in an effort to prove that they are not racist against people of color. If non-whites intend to truly find out if Caucasians are their friends, they need only to bring up one man, O.J. Simpson. Ask a white person that may seem cool what their thoughts are on the O.J. Simpson verdict, and they will quickly unmask their racism while simultaneously revealing what they truly feel about their non-white friends. When whites rush to proclaim how many friends they have that are people of color, what they are really saying is, I have non-white friends that wish they were white. Just as in all of their systems and programs, whites will handpick the most docile and subservient people of color to round out their roster of friends. People of color should note that these whites do not generally have a respect for their cultures. This friends proclamation is nothing more than a dishonest charade that is part of them wearing the mask. These whites are nothing like Caucasians that have used their influence and voice to expose other whites for injustice and unfair practices. Even with those cases considered, however, in the exchange people of color have had with white people, the bad still outweighs the good. Non-whites shouldn't be in such a rush to hold hands and be friends with whites. If Caucasians were at the receiving end of the same abuse that they inflicted upon non-whites, Caucasians wouldn't be as forgiving as people of color. White people will exploit non-whites' desire for friendship by telling them now, what's done is done. And forget about the past, as if persons of color should not object to the current status or state of race, relations, or poverty. It would seem that whites want non-whites to celebrate white people's success, be happy, because white people are doing well and disregard their own people's condition and status. People of color must never forget that. Overall, despite those rare occasions, white people do not defend them the way that they defend whites. More often than not, white people's actions are always with disingenuous intentions. For instance, consider then whites make public trips to countries where the people are of color. White people are not traveling to any country or community that they destroyed and readily admitting their faults and directly correcting them. This is never going to happen. This is left to non-whites to identify the imbalanced relationship that they have with whites, work to strengthen the bonds with their own people, and rebuild their lands independent of Caucasian influence. From here on out, people of color should see whites true intentions when they offer help in their communities and lands. It is dangerous to think of these whites as friends. Always keep their history in mind. Occasionally, some whites remark that whites don't have an all-encompassing, monolithic plan or thought process. Then people of color will notice that globally, Caucasians who have never met each other engage people of color with the exact same disrespect and injustice. This proves that the disdain whites have for people of color is natural to Caucasians. People of color should never drop their defense again and think that any whites have their best interests in mind. If whites had natural respect, justice, and goodwill in their hearts for all humans, why is their history bloody everywhere that they travel? Why don't they have a pleasant track record? If whites were good-natured, why didn't they naturally respond peaceably and fairly to all the people and lands they were welcome to? The evil that whites exhibited throughout history lies dormant in every one of them, like a wild animal sedated to perform a temporary stage show. On a general, safe scale, there is no such thing as cool white people. But if people of color continue to believe that such a thing exists, they will hurt themselves just as much as whites harm them from day to day. This reveals the fundamental flaw that people of color have. They love. They cannot hate to the core. People of color hope there is some good in others. They could never in a million years fathom the depths of what white people would plan for non-whites. But they must begin to. People of color must try to imagine what acts white people would commit to preserve themselves. It's much better to be safe than to be sorry and surprised. History does not forecast a change in the relationships between people of color and whites. For their survival in the future, people of color absolutely must change the way they interact with whites. However, ultimately, the best way to deal with white people is not to deal with them at all, in every aspect. The end. This is a book called How to Deal with White People, a quick, easy to read handbook by David Goldberg. At last, an honest, straightforward, and unapologetic guide to help reduce culture shock between the races. Using the methods and tips within, you can erase the confusion of interacting with white people, establishing a more direct approach, ensuring your own sense of peace. Learn how to communicate with whites. Identify which whites wear the mask. Inside you'll find these points as well as why whites are more courageous in the workplace. The office is white people's turf. Why there still is little to no diversity in entertainment. Whites own all media. People of color own no outlets. How to activate your very own personal white people BS decoder. Whites say, let the past go, decode it. Let us do what we want and shut up. Why, when you think something is racist, it usually is. Consider any 50 years of whites living with non-whites, any 50 years, any time period. David Goldberg has been white all of his life. He realized the importance of being Jewish, and he appreciated the benefits allowed to him in the book, music, film, and TV industries. He now feels the need to share his observations with people of color around the world. That's it. So, I heard that. I could go into scriptures to bring forth all they was saying pertaining to what the Most High says we got to deal with. But I hope that was entertaining for you. I hope that you will take heed to what was said. How to deal with white people. Shalom.